is the controversial work Dark Deleuze. This work is incredibly refreshing for Deleuze scholars as well as enlightening for its presentation of an interesting Deleuzean adaptational framework. Okay, so I just have like a quick summary. I'm going to share screen because I don't want to have to like continually explain when I'm using quotes. So a lot of these are quotes from Professor Culp. So yes, just so you guys can see. In Andrew Culp's Dark Deleuze, we are challenged to engage with the Deleuzean corpus from an alternative orientation, or what Culp calls negativity. The concern being that when the book is published, 2016, a dominant thread of Deleuzean scholarship has overtaken academia and bathed the work in fanatical joyousness. In other words, Deleuze's philosophy is seen as hyper-affirmative, hyper-positive, and hyper-activating. The main components of this canon of joy include connectivism and productivism. We can view connectivism as an organizing technique with the promiscuous inclusion of seemingly unrelated elements into a single body to expand its capacities. We observe that relations have gone global. Productivism, on the other hand, admires creation and the production of the new without actually producing something new or something from true exteriority. This process occurs through the mechanisms of accumulation and reproduction. Given these two components, connectivity and production, we can see how scholars might interpret Deleuze along this terrain, and. The danger for Culp is that joyous Deleuze could very possibly be an anesthetic in the guise of a stimulant. The connections and productions in play are too embedded in capitalism and the state. What looks like a line of flight is actually a buttress for the status quo. Global technical connections like social media and the use of the new to obtain capital are only reiterations of the dominant political machine. If they have any revolutionary power, it is minimal. This is why Culp uses Dark Deleuze to advocate for a new death, the death of this world. We are already in the process of the death of God and the death of man. Each death denounces a concept as insufficient, critiques those who still believe in it, and demands its removal as an object of thought. The concept to be removed here is world, or Culp's alternative term for assemblage. The death of the world allows for a destruction of certain knowledge forms with an important gamble. Only by destroying this world will we release ourselves of its problems. The capitalist regime cannot be restructured and reworked from within. It must be torn down to allow new possibilities to emerge. What we find in Deleuze are viable tools that can be used in support of this kind of project, but only if we are conscientious of the possible dogma in a positive interpretation of his work. We must keep ourselves open to the most revolutionary avenue for confronting the work of Deleuze, and that orientation is from the crypt, not the chapel. Culp provides us with a phenomenal framework by which to pursue the activity of Dark Deleuze. He gives two terms for every task, one relating to the joyous and the other to the dark. So, for example, assemblages, unbecoming, realism, materialism, acceleration, escape. Each doublet is related to a specific task, such as speed, ethics, affect, and nomadism. The pairing terms are not opposites or binary contradictions, but rather contraries. Each contrary is a forked path, an alternate route for every instance one is tempted by affirmation. The dark terms are alternative possibilities, not mutually exclusive components of their joyous counterparts. Meaning, if we engage with the dark terms, eventually we could abandon the joyous ones altogether. This is Culp's ultimate goal for his readers. The dark side is preferable because these terms have the power to overthrow their joyous counterparts. And those joyous terms should be overthrown because what makes the dark terms dark is a position of exteriority from which the irregular forces of darkness attack the joy of state thought. The terms of darkness are outside of the political machine enough to refuse its permanence. We might say the dark terms are not tools for creation, they are bombs for destruction. So I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Andrew Culp. Thank you so much. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, and Alex for those really generous remarks. It's really exciting to be in a room with people who've paid such close attention to the things you've written. In particular, a few things about your remarks already. I really appreciate your emphasis on the stakes of the discussion, because I think that one could get caught up in particular moves, which I'm happy to discuss or even defend. Um, but I think it's these wider problematics, which are the ones that motivated the work, and I'm excited to continue sort of thinking through with everyone here. The second, though brief, your reference to the anesthetic is something that's actually quite familiar in conversations with my students, because we quite commonly read Susan Buckmorse on her reading of Benjamin and aesthetic and anesthetic. I've actually been doing work on an older essay of hers recently, in which she tries to ask, why did the Soviet avant-garde fail? And she has this really great reading about the vanguard and the avant-garde, and really trying to pull the sort of aesthetic modernism of the avant-garde, and try and distinguish it just from subservience to a political formation. And so I'm already getting a lot of important connections there. And then third, I think the most important thing is the problem of dogmatism and trying to escape dogmatic images of thought. So if nothing else sort of comes from this conversation today, perhaps it should also be a way of escaping from even some of the dogmatisms that I've presented, to see what sort of might be coming new, or what might be still developing within Deleuze scholarship. But I have a few prepared remarks. Hopefully, I don't take too long. I'm thinking it might be about 15 minutes. If it gets much longer than that, stop, because I want to make sure that we have a lot of time for conversation. So before presenting the original thoughts, I thought that you all might appreciate me reanimating the corpus of Dark Deleuze to provide some shared reference points for our conversation. So the way I imagine it is the body of the book is a series of monstrous evolution of Deleuze's thought. And to understand those evolutionary lines that I'm drawing, I would consider two images of thought that are preferred by Deleuze himself. The first is Borges' story of the Garden of Working Paths, where decision structures the maze of truth. And Alex so brilliantly already mentioned this, so this could be a further conversation. And the second image is the development of species, in which the division of a single species into two separate ones is not already pre-decided or a matter of fate, or sometimes not even decision. And it's the, let's say, molecular or unbecoming version of speciation, explored in a number of places. And sort of following the method, I identify concepts from Deleuze and Guattari, or just Deleuze himself, that I found maybe stopped doing the work that they were meant to in the original context. And so I resurrect a series of contrasting approaches from Deleuze's corpus to animate things in a new way. And as Alex mentioned, there are these series of contrasts. Some of them, I think, do more and better work than others. It is worth noting that they're meant to be in an asymmetrical relation. So they're not meant to immediately just fold into a dialectic of, let's say, if it was light and dark, or positive, purely negative. So they're meant to already be in a formally strange match. And the goal of the argument has not so much been to present an argument to be disputed, or even worse, to simply be agreed with, but to provide a sort of alternative map or diagram through which DNG could find their own, or people who study DNG could find their own path forward, to extend, to add to, but maybe even in the best case scenario, for you to make your own, to sort of provoke and evoke. So, well, Dark Deleuze, I think, has been a success in terms of sort of disrupting or provoking some Deleuzians from a sort of dogmatism. I think that the breathing life into the monster and the new monsters is still something that is undergoing, and I could see being reinvigorated even more. So in terms of the original things, I want to just mention three very simple concepts for those readers of Deleuze, both old and new, their whole life, or just getting started. I think they're already quite present, symptomatic, latent on the surface, and hopefully orient our thought in a productive direction. And those three things are: first, the problem; second, the questions of means or method or process; and the third being question of style. So the problem, or perhaps more particularly, Deleuze has discussed for propositions, axiomatics, and thought experiments, comes from a revulsion to propositional thinking. And, in the deep, long tradition of French philosophy, this might be a bit peculiar for those who want to go back to Descartes or a rationalist geometric method. But Deleuze himself finds such forms of argumentation bloodless, good only for court philosophers who are seeking to repeat a form of state thinking or state thought. And I'm thinking of the state here in two senses. The first, the state whose institutions survey land to make it into a territory to be conquered, which is to say, to collect statistics on people and things, to make them into a population or resources. And then second, state as in a static, stable, fixed state of affairs, which goes to what is philosophy in particular. So Deleuze, by contrast, professed to only liking one thought experiment, the so-called problem of future contingents, whereby statements like there will be a sea battle tomorrow. And what he seemed to like about these is that they could be true when spoken, but given the unruly contingency of the future, the battle also might not happen. And this undermines a certain ground of truth itself. And I'm thinking of this excellent book, Aberrant Movements, that considers Deleuze as someone who isn't afraid of ground, but in fact poses a ground only contingently in order to sort of unground it. And so the alternative to this simple grounding of truth, was that conceptual issues established by a state of affairs instead be seen as a problematic. And that means things that are seen as fixed or intractable, or this is what I often discuss as the intolerable. As a brief digression, I'll say that, I think there's this, it's not a sort of heroism of thought always in Deleuze. It sometimes comes from a place of incredible tragedy or frustration. Like, he mentions Primo Levi, so that's thinking after the camp, or also thought itself not being strong enough to push against a lot of the forces of the world. I'm thinking of the epigraph to Negotiations, in which he says that it's only good for a sort of strange form of guerrilla warfare. So I think that when thinking about this, when does thought arise? I think it's when the only capacity that we have left to address something, the intolerable, is thought itself. Okay, so end of my digression, sorry. So what's interesting for Deleuze is he doesn't try and end the problematic, but he tries to elevate a problem to a problem for thought that could then be turned against a state of affairs that's looking to establish a state solution. And in this, I don't mean to be abstract. I mean, they're very tangible things. As someone who's interested in social political philosophy, I often mine the text for very particular examples of things like oppression, so violence against women, incarceration of socially undesirable people, operations of kinds of policing, as well as enduring structures of oppression, like anti-Blackness or heteronormativity. And I think that it's not a surprise why Deleuzean thought has been such a resource in people doing this type of work over the last few decades, because I really think that this is the minoritarian question that comes out of the 60s is really such an important element of the, and to ignore it or to be to do it a disservice. So in terms of Dark Deleuze, I propose that the greatest problem we face is not sovereign power, as sometimes allegorized by Nietzsche as the assault on God, nor is our worst challenge an issue of simple subject transformation. And this is maybe where Deleuze and Guattari maybe sort of have a disagreement or something, or at least the way I read it. Instead, following Greg Flaxman, look at the question of ends and deaths. So the death of the human, and then I say that we've actually moved beyond the death of the human, the famous empirical transcendental doublet of order of things, and instead we're now in the midst of this imminent death of the world. And it's a death that I sort of provocatively say is not something that should be prevented. And in fact, many of the problems that we are facing today come from those who are simply trying to prevent death of the world as we currently know it. And as with Nietzsche's approach to the death of God, it's already happening. And in fact, if we were to hasten the process, we might have an opportunity to return to novelty or invention, some of these other approaches that I've sort of gestured to with the outside. So that's the problem. Two, in terms of method, I would say that if there's a hero in Anti-Oedipus, it's not actual schizophrenics who are instead tragic figures. We read closely, the actual clinical schizo is someone whose body cannot handle the dizzying and reterritorializing effect of capitalism. And so for one reason or another, only specific individuals sort of stand in possibly heroic positions, such as the Black Panther George Jackson, who himself suffered a sort of double erasure, both as a Black man who's incarcerated, but also in terms of his ability to participate in politics, given he was in prison for all of his political life. And what it connects to is DNG's interest later in the void and a different sort of hero that first appears in Anti-Oedipus, but is given content in Thousand Plateaus with the Nomad. And there's been much ink spilled on the Nomad. So for me, I'm interested in sort of taking it a step further. So one way to think of it might be in this connection to Leibniz's monad. So the monad becomes nomad. And this takes a series of itinerant journeys, no doubt in dialogue with Guattari's colleague Deligny, who was interested in subversive lines and sort of was interested in the clinical situation a bit. And some commentators stop there, just sort of looking at the idea of drawing lines or drawing new lines, maybe even mutation, transgression, or weirdness is sort of the consequence. But I think D&G are quite clear on what drives the nomad, and it's the operations of the war machine. And so that ends up being the first concept I actually deal with in the body of the book. And I think that there are attempts to metaphorize the question of the war machine. It is true that they say that war is only a secondary operation, but I remember reading Deleuze in the Political a long time ago, and Hatton talks about the nomad in a very particular way that fits quite comfortably within Canadian political philosophy around liberalism. And so that's something that I was looking to sort of tease apart a little bit. And so there are a few pages into D&G's work, they mention that rhizomatics should confront the world through, quote, a guerrilla logic point of view. So that's something that I was looking to first explore in Dark Deleuze, and then in fact took as inspiration in the second book that I can. So what would it mean to take seriously their interest in developing guerrilla logic point of view? I think that it begins, like any problematic does, by taking issue of life and death, where important things hang in the balance. And also, rather than thinking like a state, which is the state to find a solution, it means to take the position of the most vulnerable, those who are, okay, this is sort of like, difference principle stuff, but instead of just sort of resolving or finding a balance, instead it's to sort of use that as a cutting edge or to turn that exploitation into a resource. So in like hacking, like computer hacking, that is an exploit. So that's just sort of an impressionistic sort of point there. And lastly, I want to just discuss style very quickly. especially because I'm talking to so many philosophers and I want to get your minds going as to what's at stake when writing and thinking with philosophers. So there's something remarkable about Deleuze in that his thinking remained consistent across all of his work, and his consistency held even as he wrote books on very different thinkers. And of course, in those books, he systematized their thought in unique ways that were his own and certainly left his own signature. And that consistency sustained, even though he used a new discourse in each book. So I would broadly say that he carries similar concepts across the books, but addresses them using differing signs. And the purpose seems clear, as Deleuze once said, that he wants his concepts to be rigorous, yet inexact, which is, say, the concepts that could change given any encounter they would have with new or different problems or different state of affairs. Okay, so there's also an unintended consequence of Deleuze changing his nomenclature. It made philosophical commentary in his work a little difficult, or at least daunting. Commentators become forced to explain and re-explain concepts in order to sort of clarify through academic writing things that seem elusive because the language becomes a little slippery. And also it becomes very challenging for first-time readers if they're looking to develop things into definitional proposition content. Certainly it can be done, and there are people in the Zoom call who've done a much better job than I have at doing this sort of work. But it seems like it's intentional rather than just a bug. And so the challenge then is twofold when it comes to commenting on Deleuze. In the one hand, to not deaden his work, which is to say to explain it so much that it makes sense and that you have a full grasp of it, but then it loses some of its excitement or its activity. So this is to say to retain its rigor, but also retain its exactness. And then the other is to foolishly imitate his style. And perhaps most people who've engaged in Deleuze have been guilty of this from time to time. But I think this is really where the major point of this portion of the remarks go for me. He calls us to respond to his own thought creatively, or I would contend. And so to sort of put this within Deleuzean jargon, I think he would want his readers and thinkers and commentators to singularize themselves. And to maybe put a very fine point on this, I think he calls us to develop our own unimitable style, say a different style than his own that can't be immediately imitated. You can think of this as ways in which people read alongside him or with him. Like what would it mean for a saxophonist to play 1,000 Plateaus, being at an art and performing art school? This is not just sort of empty experiment for me. Or what would it mean for someone who is a computer hacker to read him at night for inspiration? And of course, there are pitfalls to this approach. We would have to evaluate the success or the good of this in very different terms than perhaps we've evaluated before. And of course, there'd be this question of how faithful do we have to be to the original? And of course, if you're too unfaithful to the original, it can lead to all kinds of problems, not only for thought, for aesthetics. And so I have a few terms that I'd maybe suggest that we would focus on if we were to approach it through style, and that's that it should be creative, compelling, virtuosic, and affecting. And this is all to say that, what if we imagine writing about Deleuze necessarily including its own line of flight, or to make it function as a war machine, and to make it problematic? So perhaps this is all just a long way of saying that that's what I was trying to do with Dark Deleuze as well, to survive everything that was going on. But in order for it to be a success, I would not want more Dark Deleuzians. I would want everyone in this room and 1,000 billion more people to come up with their own singular interpretation, new stylistic approach, and you know, your your own, not mine. But more than happy to, like I said, defend or debate, or even just explore things along with you. And that's all I have.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the questions. You can raise your hand. You can use the little hand signal at the bottom. And I'll just keep track of who has a question, and I'll go in order from what I see right away. But I just want to open it up to anybody who wants to start off with a question. Do we need to think it through a little bit? Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I can start off. So hi, Andrew. Nice to meet you in virtual space here, and thanks for coming and participating in this. It's absolutely fantastic, and thanks to Alex for a really fantastic and helpful introduction. So I've been reading Dark Deleuze over the past few days, preparing for this, and I really like your comments. I like your last comment on virtuosity, actually, because I often think of something similar, like the notion of truth, that, you want to correspond with reality, but it's like a musician. Like I play piano a little bit and try to do, whatever, Mozart or Chopin. And sometimes I can play, but then I listen to people like Glenn Gould who play the same notes, but they're a virtuoso, and there's a difference. You can play, but there's a virtuosity, and I like that idea that there's a virtuosity in philosophy as well that we should think about and don't too often. It's not a category we apply to philosophers, but I like that notion that maybe we should. so thanks for that, and a lot of other things you said. Good comment on. But I just had two questions from Dark Deleuze. Maybe I'll start with them, and they're kind of, as you say, the philosopher questions. So it's maybe unfair to saddle you with these, but there were two places in it where you kind of complain. My first question about people confusing. This is page 13 and I forget where else, 40, I wrote this down somewhere, 13 and 43, confusing metaphysics for politics. And I'm curious about what you think about that, because, Deleuze said he was a pure metaphysician. And even when he writes, he likes Spinoza's Ethics, but he says really Spinoza's Ethics is a book on metaphysics and ontology, pure metaphysics, and yet he calls it an ethics. And he says the reason he does so is because there's a direct link between the two. And you seem to, have hesitations about that, which I'd be really interested in hearing more about. So that's one question. And then the other one is partly, it's on page 20, what you had one of these few statements where you just come out and say, what Dark Deleuze is achieving its ostensible goal. And you say three things: the end of this world, the final defeat of the state, and then full communism. So the first two I could see. Full communism introduces a kind of, obviously Marxism in the Communist Manifesto sense, but a kind of teleology, a goal, kind of a state that we're going to get to. And that one surprised me. The first two I kind of followed with what you're saying in the book. So I wondered just if, first on relation of metaphysics to all this, given what Deleuze is doing, is it necessary, or maybe Deleuze pushes that too hard as a philosopher? And then this teleological goal of something like communism. So just two questions to get the discussion going.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe this is like my fanboy moment, but like your work has been the absolute best of any Anglophone work on the list that I've ever read. And so I'm just so honored to be here in conversation. I found a MP3 copy of the lectures you gave to the Collegium long time ago on Deleuze and politics, and re-uploaded them, scrubbed them, like it was a bad recording, like there was some feedback problems.
I remember that, yes.
Fixed it, and it's available now on archive.org.
Okay, because I would like to hear that, because I remember listening to those and they were impossible to listen to because at archive.org. I'll look that up. Thanks.
And it's missing one lecture, and it's one of the lectures on capitalism, if I remember correctly. And I was just so disappointed. I mean, this was years ago. This was 15 years ago or something. And I still have these fantasies of like what you talked about in the capitalism section. Like tried to imagine what you would have said or something. But anyway, sorry for all the fanboy.
That's all right. I'll dig up my notes and send them to you. I'm sure I have them
It would be
somewhere.
amazing.
Anyway.
I'd love it. Yeah, for the metaphysics question, actually, this is something that Greg Flaxman impressed on me. I mean, I really like his work. I wish he published more. But I mean, I wish everyone did, because he wrote that like big book, and he's like, oh, volume one in a 2-volume series, and the second volume just like it's anywhere. I'm like, where's it gonna go?
Never announced 2 volumes. That's always a danger. It's
Worse, right? So I was talking to him at a conference, and I had not been reading the Zurabichvili stuff, and he was like, you need to read this, because he has this very compelling argument for why we shouldn't read Deleuze purely as an ontologist, but as a theorist of the event. And so I think that the way that gets sort of like condensed into an argument, sometimes maybe a little too strongly, is that it's sort of anti-metaphysics. And I think that really the move is to say that something like new materialism, or maybe something that's not even as nimble as new materialism, that if it's merely trying to sort of like state a metaphysics, like provide a end-all be-all metaphysical schema or something like that, is not doing the important, I mean, like I cash it out socially and politically. I would be interested to see where philosophers would find it. But with like uh Kieran's little description in the compilation of the philosophy of event translations of Zurabichvili, I mean, I've really latched on this idea that the way to think about the future in Deleuze, which is very much where I see politics, or at least revolution or something like that, is the non-resemblance of the present. And so it's the event of the present no longer resembling what the present had been previously, is this like passage from the present to the future. And so that means it's probably undoing some sort of statement about the grounding ontology or existence of something. It's in more sort of like post-structuralist terms, it might just be like the undoing of a system or some other structure that we're looking at. I mean, I'm thinking of like, I don't know, structuralist anthropology. We have these very clear like kinship structures. And if we were to undo one of those kinship structures, like it doesn't necessarily state what comes after it. So I'm not sure if this is anti-metaphysical as much as it's just trying to get out of the question of ontology. And the way Zurabichvili reads it, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with, but other people in the room might not be, is in the sort of like and being a joke on like etra. So it's like is. And so instead of being a question of like the is, it's maybe a question of like the not yet, or the outside, or like in Liz Gross, she talks about it not so much as becoming, but unbecoming. And so it's just that, or like in that like 7-part typology of structuralism that Deleuze does, like the last one is the empty square. So for me, it's like making sure that there's space for the empty square, and that's a sort of, I don't know if it's a negative move, or it's the void, or it's what some of these other terms that we've created in order to do it, but it's to make sure that there's this movement, and there's this ungrounding, and there's this undoing. And as long as we make a place for that in our metaphysics, I think that maybe it still is pure metaphysics in the way that he does. But I think that it's also remarkable that like there is metaphysical consistency across his work. But as he's working through different philosophers or different approaches, there's different words for it. It doesn't always exactly seem to fit up the same way. So I don't know. I think that's a curiosity of mine. I don't know how fulfilling that sounds.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's actually helpful, because I think a lot of it is, Deleuze, when he says he's a pure metaphysician, I always think it's not tongue in cheek, but it's because so much of the philosophy around him at the time was anti-metaphysical. It's the end of metaphysics, Derrida, Heidegger, everyone's doing that. So partly provocation on his part to say, I'm doing metaphysics. I think Zurishvili and others are doing the same with ontology, because you move from the AEST to the AET to the and then it's easy to say, well, it's no longer the verb to be, so it's no longer ontology. But at the same time, from a Deleuzean point of view, you can say, well, it's just a new concept of ontology. It's sort of what you said at the end, like it's hard to nail down Deleuze because you want to get a propositional definition, but his concepts are in constant becoming, they're tied to time. So but that makes it a dicey issue. What is it metaphysics? We've been talking about this. I'm teaching Deleuze now that, if Deleuze is a metaphysician, that means he knows what the nature of reality is. And you want to press him on that. Well, what is it? And he says, well, it's a problem, which means we don't actually know. That's his metaphysics in the end of what reality is. But because it's problematic, it constantly generates the new and new solutions to that. So no, I like what you say, but it's a very interesting philosophical question for me. So I like the nuance you give to that. So
Absolutely. And I just with Alex Galloway, I did a 9-part podcast reading of Badiou's being an event, like section by section. And I'm not like a huge Lacanian in my like reading of Badiou, is that he's basically like trying to do to metaphysics what Lacan did to psychoanalysis or the subject. And so there's always this question of like the negativity and the void and all of that. And I don't especially love the way that Badiou does it, but I'm very curious about it. And actually your writing on it has been very instrumental for me understanding precisely what's going on. You've done some of the comparative writing. So I'm curious of like, what is the event for Deleuze if it's not just this like slow accretion of micro differences that are almost like immeasurable? And can there be big events as well? Can there be these moments in which things like really radically change? And if so, that seems interesting politically for me as well. Which I guess is a segue into the second.
Yeah. We'll go ahead. I mean, I think comparing Deleuze and Badiou on the event is quite an interesting project, because Badiou will say certain things are events and they're not, others are not events. And I think Deleuze has a much broader notion of event, for better, for worse.
Yeah.
But,
and I think it's been under discussed maybe, but maybe I'm just not reading the right things. But yeah, in this series, okay, end of the world, yeah, cool. We can do that. This world is this great sort of philosophical term that we bat around quite a bit. Personally, I really like going to Afro-Caribbean thought about the world too, because I think that gives it a lot of strength and specificity. Césaire as well spun on. Defeat of the state, obviously clearly in their work. Communism, okay. This is like my hobby horse. So I read a lot of Marxists, and I went to Ohio State to study with Gene Holland, who like is very clearly to combine Marxism with DNG. But I think that it has to be a very peculiar Marxism, maybe what was called open Marxism, though I think the term has sort of died out. I of course read a lot of my like autonomist Marxism. I have like no interest in like state communism, and there are a lot of like these dissident and sort of minor Marxist traditions. And so I was just trying to think of like maybe I violated my own sort of principles here by giving something positive rather than simply negative. But like I think I do give a minimal definition in there of communism as like a cessation of the class relation as well as an end of capitalism or something like that. So I still give it a rather negative definition, which is the form of communism I like. This is also how Marx will define it as the as a negative movement as well. The has to do with non-exist. Sorry, I'm so jet lagged right now. I can't pull the quote out. But there's also this challenge of like defining what communism might actually be, and there are a lot of different interpretations. So like David Graeber will have sort of his own definition of what it is, and he has a sort of anthropological, like just people getting together. Mine I think is more abstract. It's a bit conceptual or formal, but I think that that's sort of the interesting place to keep it as well. I'm remembering back to debates maybe about 15 years ago when there was this sort of attempt to like reinvigorate communism that had people who probably wouldn't want to be together anymore, sort of debating this. So like Cesare Casarino, as well as Jody Dean. And like Jody Dean is now like a pretty hardcore Leninist. You know, she's affiliated with the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation. And, you know, they have a very specific party-based approach. And then, you know, like the autonomists, particularly like the ones that I like the most, like they're very post-party, like the party is like, and so I think that that starts to answer this question that like, I mean, maybe other people in this room would have insight on this, but there's that very late interview that Deleuze has with Negri, in which Negri is like, hey, are you still a Marxist? And he says, well, you know, I think both Felix and I have maintained Marxists, but in our own way, in a different way. And I wrote a piece trying to kind of address this a little bit. And I was trying to say that they're not just sort of, you know, they haven't given up their Marxism. They really see that there's something important. So I feel like I danced around the issue. I didn't really address it very clearly, but I appreciated the provocations.
Yeah, well, sorry, one more thing, and then I'll let other people go. But I like what you say, because I've been reading Graeber recently, you know, his big new book. But, you know, he did Occupy. It was sort of the same question Deleuze and Guattari asking with the nomadology. Is there a form of collective organization that's not only outside the state, but directed against the state? So Deleuze and Guattari do the nomadology. But when I was reading Graeber, I felt like he was posing the same question on the organizations, you know, he thought that the Occupy movement were doing were sort of versions of the same thing. So there's an interesting conjunction there. So I appreciated you mentioned him. Yeah, because it's easy to say communism is just kind of some ideal end goal that we're all supposed to be striving for. I think it's way more complicated than that. So thanks. No, I appreciate your work and your comments, and thanks again for being here. I'm just gonna have to apologize. I have to dash off at 1 o'clock, unfortunately, for another meeting, just a schedule issue. So I'm glad I got to come in first, chat a bit. So thanks.
And very briefly, I think that this is one of the key disagreements between Foucault and DNG. DNG have their nomadology, so they do have an outside, and it's the way I parse it is that the state is a dialectic and the nomad is what escapes the dialectic. So it's this like very different logic. Whereas Foucault kind of says there's no outside. He says wherever there's power, there's resistance, and he's always looking for the resistance imminent to the version of power that exists. But it doesn't seem like he's ever trying to pose this sort of like affirmative outside project. And I think that it leads to some disagreements strategically, politically, whatever, between the two of them. And so that's something that's kind of important to parse out.
I agree with that, and I appreciated the prominence you gave to the category, the outside, in this book, because I think you're absolutely right. Because Deleuze says somewhere, I didn't need a notion of resistance because I started someplace differently than Foucault. I need a notion of capture, because if everything is moving and problematic, the question is how you capture that. But then the movement, the resistance, so to speak, was built into his, you know, metaphysics and ontology already, whereas Foucault didn't have that, so he needed a way, you know, notion of resistance as the counterpoint to power. So, you know, that politically they're very similar, but because they have different starting points, their conceptual apparatus is different, and that too is interesting. But thank you again, and I'll leave it to others. So thanks, Andrew.
Okay, Ahmet, did you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Andrew, for this great talk. So I will lump a couple of questions together and ask it. So first one is kind of general. So my question is like, what awaits us after the death of this world? This question is important for me because I think in Deleuze, kind of this idea of disruption is very central, but disruption or destruction always, like, I think, conceptualized as a creative destruction or disruption, because like Deleuze is aware that like every destruction comes with a construction, like must come with a construction. So in some sense, he wants to give us a criteria for creation of the new. And I think this idea of joy comes at this point. I am not sure about this, like I'm not sure if I understand him correctly, but in some way, the the joy is not in the process of distraction, but in a way gives us a criteria of what is to be created. So I just wonder what you think about, like, or what are your thoughts surrounding this issue of what is to come? Because I think I'm not sure, like, if the idea of disruption or distraction is like it is in Deleuze very prominent, I think, but there is also idea of creative or like positivity in Deleuze as well, as to what is to come. So what do you think about this, like what is to come? Like what are your thoughts about it? Yeah, I have a couple of more questions, but maybe we can start with this.
Yeah, really important question, because it's really at the core of at least the focus of this book. So there's a number of answers. They might add up to something. I think they each have their own path, and maybe that's what's interesting and exciting about it. So the first is, what does the experimental mean? And I read a lot of philosophy, though I think that maybe I'm more of a dabbler than anything else. But I think this has to do with his very radical reading of empiricism. And so I think that experimentations are things that have to like actually be done, and that for him that it doesn't have a predefined outcome, and it's determined a lot according to just the circumstance in which things are played out. And in fact, try and have a predetermined outcome itself is to no longer have it be experimental. And so I think there's, to me, this sort of emphasis on open-endedness and process, though, feels a little dissatisfying sometimes. So if you similarly feel dissatisfied by just saying like open experimentation and it's all about the real and what actually happens, then okay, I'm on the same board as you. But that's a start. Answer two, I get from Susan Ruddock's excellent comparative piece called "The Politics of Affect," in which she compares Negri's joyous communism to this like much less commented on piece in which, both through Deleuze's short book on Spinoza, but then also some lectures and other things that Deleuze talks about with Leibniz, says that the role of the philosopher is to screen. And so in that way, it's to disrupt. And she connects it back to the Spinoza's question of how the tyrant can rule us through our passions. And so the most important thing is not so much to reconfigure the passions and tell us what passions need to be directed and what they will. I mean, Negri will say this is communism, but it's merely disrupt the tyrant's attempt to rule us through our passions. Okay, that's once again one of these sort of negative moves that might feel a little dissatisfying. There is this other thing. I mean, like, I completely abhor him, rarely mention him by name, and think that he has very few contributions to philosophy. But one of the few things that Nick Land ever wrote that I found interesting was this term that he talks about in terms of auto production. And so for him, this is how production isn't always a voluntary or a willed process. In fact, it can be a passive process that is always ongoing, perhaps even in, let's say, the background or something like that. And so it's to say that, like, one doesn't need to be so affirmatively productivist, because at least within the metaphysics of anti-Oedipus, for instance, production's always going on all the time, right? This is the whole thing about how the death drive is not like the cessation of the drive, but it's just merely the switching from one object to another, or maybe even getting to, Lacan's like polymorphous perversity, or Freud's free and detached libido. And so the idea there would be that, like, it's once again the sort of like more just opening things up. callously, it might feel callous sometimes, like you're just leaving it up to others to figure it out. Like, I'm going to be a problem. I'm introducing the problem, then something else happens. But I think the real question is like the object world, needs to be interrogated. We need to criticize it or oppose it or however we're going to approach it. But what comes after the world is, we won't know until we get there. I mean, one way of thinking about lines of flight for me was that, there are some people who think that DNG are n+1 thinkers, where you're like adding new dimensions to a system or a structure. But they talk about being n-1 thinkers. And so I had to really think about like, what does it mean for things to be -1? There's some like technical mathematical ways of going at it, but like the really simple way of me thinking about it is like a line of flight is some sort of force where you have a system that's defined by n dimensions. And what if you take away one of its determining or structuring dimensions? Like, what happens to that system or structure? And I think that's really what the question is with the end of the world. Like, what are the things that we take for given or think are necessary to like keep the world as the way it is, and we get rid of one of those? What will it push us towards? Of course, we're facing some of that right now with the environmental catastrophe, and then it could be pushing us towards things like eco-fascism or even a newfound eco-capitalism. And so I think, there's an element of, let's say, opposition or confrontation or something that has to happen. My advisor, Gene Holland, he wrote this really strong book about nomadism and nomad philosophy, in which he has one chapter that's just about the death state. And then a few years later, for an article for DNG Studies, he says, but now in the world of climate catastrophe, like, we need a global, coordinated, institutional response. And so he basically like goes back on the sort of like question of the death state. And so I think that, even dyed-in-the-wool people are asking if these tools are effective enough for us to deal with the immensity of the problems that we're facing now. So I don't know. I don't have any answers for you. I don't know what comes after the end of the world, but hopefully it's not worse than what we have now. And that's the sort of gamble.
Yeah, like the idea is like this. I think the question is like I was expecting this answer actually, because this is the answer. Like, you don't know, because the essence of what is to come is it's novelty in any way. But maybe it's because like this question because of my particular like interest. This like within this period, like what is the criteria to like ethical and political criteria to novelty? Because if like if there is no criteria for what is to come, then what will come about may bring even more detrimental forms of existence, let's say, in general. So that's why, like, in general, I think this might be a question for Deleuze, maybe. But yeah, thanks. So let me I have a couple.
Maybe very, very briefly, just to sort of follow up on that. I think this is the high modernism of Deleuze too. And so I'd say, look to the historic avant-garde, like the Russian futurists, for instance. And obviously, this can go fascist. There was a version of modernism that goes high fascist with Marinetti and the Italians. But I was recently reading this great play that wasn't performed for decades, called Victory Over the Sun, in which the Russian constructionists put on this play where they're capturing the sun and destroying it, right? Because it's a sign of everything that's about the dominance of the past, blah, blah, blah. And part of it was part of their poetic project as well, to create a version of the Russian language that had no sense, but instead had phonetic quality to it. And so they were trying to mix in elements of the language that were interesting and creative and aesthetic here. And so anyway, this is all a long way to saying that, like, I think there are these moments of experimentation in the historic avant-garde that in fact people have really tried to think about these questions in really robust and interesting ways. And it would be worthwhile to return to some of those if it hasn't been an object of study for you previously.
Okay, does anybody else have a question? Okay, I have a couple of my own.
Alex?
Oh, sorry, James, do you have a question?
Yeah. So hi, Andrew. I'm James Emery, second year PhD student here at Purdue. And I really like the broad project of developing a dark Deleuze. I think the joyous concepts that he develops and that's sort of has been overemphasized, I think, in the literature. And what's been neglected is how often the death instinct occurs in his metaphysics. You know, the third synthesis of time, which he eventually christens the death instinct, is the royal repetition. It's the most profound, and it's the one that is sort of at the base of his metaphysics. And then he'll say that the surface of sense is cracked in logic of sense. So I think there is need for, more scholarship, more talk of Deleuze's confrontations with what you call negativity, what I would probably resist saying negativity because it just has that Hegelian connotation, just saying, death and forces of dissolution, forces of unbinding instead of binding and connection. So I think that's a great direction, your project. The two questions I had were, why exactly hatred for the world, and how do you see Deleuze's philosophy as co-opting a sort of hatred for this world when his Nietzsche book and his Nietzscheism in general is so targeted at the man of resentment whose thinking and life begins from a negation of this world in favor of some ideal that he posits, outside of it. That's my first question. And the second question is, why did you write a book that goes so quickly? It's almost, by the time I got my teeth into one of your concepts or one of your ideas, it's already on to the next one. And there is a certain virtue to speed, but I was just wondering exactly why you chose this speed exactly. So yeah.
Both amazing questions, and sounds like a really amazing project. Like I think I cite some of those difference in repetition moments in which it's like the earth cracking apart, and it being should have been a sci-fi book, and all those sort of great moments. I think I also maybe mentioned that sort of like very brief book review he does of Faustus Axellus pretty briefly, which itself has these sort of like, I mean, he's like, that guy's like so Heideggerian, they couldn't keep the correspondence going too long because of it. But it's more abstractly or conceptually, like there are all these moments of the D and the un and the A that happen just throughout all of the different books. And so I think that people maybe haven't spent enough time or attention with those. I don't know. I'm trying to think of like how much I've seen people use like the Francis Bacon book, for instance. Like maybe not a lot. I mean, certainly it shows up sometimes. Or like I guess the film people have made the whole Cinema 1 and 2 project into its whole different field that's connected to these. But my students like reading the cinema books with me a lot too, and there are these moments in cinema Cinema 2 in particular, that I think connects to this wider project. In terms of hatred, actually, I have to give some of the credit in hatred to Jose Rosales, who's a collaborator that I had for a long time, and we still collaborate on a few things. And I was like thinking through the project a little bit, and I was trying to figure out like what was the concept to really think about how to work through this belief in the world problem. Of course, is tied to James. And I'd been unhappy with the way that Maurizio Lazzarato had used it. Lazzarato made a really big deal of belief in this world as sort of his reason for why he wasn't a Marxist anymore. And he wrote this kind of during the anti-globalization period, but he writes it later, in which he's just like, Marxism is such an old, stale 20th century thing. No one needs this anymore. And so it's just, there's no reason to keep, using this wooden tongue or whatever we might refer to it. And there are a lot of people who did that. And this was very popular with the French sort of 68ers. A lot of them gave up on Marxism in like the 70s and 80s, or I guess 80s. Maybe it's because of the Mitterrand stuff. I don't know. But they sort of like dispense of it and they become not Marxists anymore. And DNG really keep it. And so I was trying to figure out like, okay, this world, how do I relate to this world? Is it belief in this world? Even the belief stuff comes up in a really funny place in cinema too, around the powers the false. And so for me, I don't know, it's maybe like inserting myself into it. It's very political. There was a conceptual question that came up when I was writing my dissertation about it actually came up when I was reading The Coming Insurrection by the Invisible Committee, in which they had this really haunting line about self-defense or pacifism, in which they're like, pacifism doesn't mean anything if you're not able to have a threat. So, right, like to not exercise force if you don't have the capacity to exercise force isn't really a capacity at all. And so they say, you know, it only means something if you have this capacity to exercise it and then you restrain yourself or you withhold it. And so the question of hatred sort of fits in there. There's also a moment in Deleuze's writings on Foucault in which he sort of mentions hatred really briefly. And I think with the Nietzsche book, the thing that I had seen in just sort of secondary literature at the time too is a lot of people were using the Nietzsche book to say like there's no space for critique. And this, I don't know if it's still popular for people to read, but this Latour claim that like criticism's done, it's over, it's run out of steam. The only thing left is actor network theory and to like build up new things. And in like cultural studies, it's about like world building. And people are like, I don't even criticize people anymore. This is like a very Donna Haraway thing. It's like, I'm done with critique. I just like cite people in their projects and sort of lift people up. And I understand the sort of like feminist politics of citation that informs some of this practice. But I was really worried that like Deleuze studies was going in this way in which like Deleuze was going to be this figure of non-criticism and not having a critical dimension to it anymore. And so maybe I put too fine of a point on it by like trying to appeal to hatred, but Jose convinced me to it. And I thought it was, once he said it, I was like, oh, this all completely makes sense. And so the part of the Nietzsche book that I pull out without dealing with this argument at all, and you're right, like someone who's more generous and thoughtful would have actually dealt with the whole Nietzsche book. But I have this moment in which, you know, Deleuze cites the person who's even worse than the critic is the person who's the yay sayer, who can always who only says yes and cannot say no. And he calls them a braying ass, you know, because like they've just, all they can do is just repeat this one move over and over and over again. And so in my like wider project, I thought it was just about this question of like renewal and like maybe things have shifted in the wrong direction and it's about shifting in the right direction again. And so I'm admittedly quite polemic in the process. And maybe I'm not as close or as good as I should be with it. As far as the speed of the book, that's a really excellent question. You know, this wasn't my dissertation or anything. I was just like writing a blog at the time, and I made this table that was like more or less the kind of the same table. I switched out a few things, but the table that like shows up in the book. And it was by far the most popular thing on the blog, like by exponents. And I was like, huh. And I was thinking, like, would this be a long book? Would this be a short book? And then Minnesota was just starting this Forerunner series. And they're like, it can't be longer. And I was like, this might be a really great thing for it. Because they're explicitly saying, like, well, if you turn blog writing into something else. And they said it can't be longer than 25,000. And I think at some point I even had to cut some of it. And so for them, it was like, okay, it has to be this length. And then I thought, well, how can I do this justice at this length? And I'm fine with working under constraints. I actually love working under constraints. I think it's really helpful to me. And so I was like, okay, I've got 25,000 words. And of course, I need to write an introduction. I need to write a conclusion. I'm just going to try and go for everything. I'm going to try and do all of it. And so I actually got out kind of a spreadsheet And like I tried to map out the 25,000 words and see where everything would be and to fit in order to be able to do all of it, which is like very much not like the Deleuzean experimental approach to it. But I was just like, I need to sort of do this as much as possible. And then after the fact, I've had people ask me if I wanted to expand it into a longer book where I sort of like explain myself or something. And then I thought, geez, it would just feel awful if I had to like switch modes and just kind of like explain myself or something. Like I feel like there's an aesthetics or a style to the whole thing, and that I'm not sure if it would be as exciting to read or if I could even sustain it if I were to have to like make it, let's say, 2 or 3 times the size that it is. And so I think it's sort of like interest and success comes from its style and its aesthetics, and that's sort of like intentionally provocative. And that in that same way of the rigorous yet inexact, like I I kind of obsessively footnote, and people can go back and read that work and see like how faithful I am to the original. I'm usually pretty good, though occasionally I take a little license. And then if you like or don't like it, then it encourages you to go and do your own work on a subject then too. Ideally, I don't know, I think. So I think it's meant to be this sort of like provocation, move on quickly. I'll note really briefly in terms of like method, this is how Marshall McLuhan writes too. And as someone who does like media theory, he calls it probe, which I think is maybe what D&G in A Thousand Plateaus, when they're talking about science being the probe head, I feel like that has to be related, even though it's not cited. And for him, the probe is meant to just sort of like introduce just enough for you to be like, oh man, I've never thought about it like that before. And then he moves on and he's like bored of it. He wants to sort of move to the next thing. And so that's what I do.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
We had another question from Brian.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you, Andrew. It was a really great to reread it. It had been a couple of years for me since I'd read it, and I felt like I actually read it very early in my Deleuze interaction, so that was probably problematic in general. But the one thing that lit up when I reread it for today was I really liked your reading of the rhizome as a problematic concept to sort of position as like a political project because of this connectionism. Because so often it's utilized in that way. And I love that you said that, oh, well, it's a very useful concept for describing the future of the world, but maybe not for some sort of political project. I thought, that was great because, yeah, the rhizome can connect, but what's it connecting to at the end of the day? It can make connections anywhere, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And I like this emphasis on the outside. But the one question I have is that there's sometimes this movement between what seems to be like a global politics and a local politics. And I think I'm always trying to think of things through a more anarchist kind of lens. So I'm curious if for you, are you thinking about global political projects? Like what's collectivization look like for you? Or is this something that's done on a more individual basis? Or is it both? Yeah, so it's kind of a vague question, but it was something that I couldn't help but think throughout the book.
Yeah, awesome. And like this sort of like complaint about the rhizome thing is not unique to me. So like when everyone was complaining, like when all of those sort of like mainstream like radical thinkers were like, what's up with all these Deleuzians? They think they're doing something new or different. And like, I don't know, like Alex Klinikos and the Socialist Workers Party in UK is like, what's all this postmodernism about? So they were already saying that like their critique was capitalism is already rhizomatic. So like, why do we need more rhizomatics? And I wanted to kind of like meet people halfway and say, maybe there is something about this complaint, but they haven't taken it seriously enough to understand where the fault line up. Like the fact that capitalism is rhizomatic actually does lend us to like a Hart and Negri style analysis where it's like it should reconfigure our strategy. And we need to ask like, are there moments where we can be more rhizomatic than capital? Are there some moments in which capital is going to outflank us because we're still tied to things like nationalism or the welfare state or things that have a very non-rhizomatic logic to them. And so I think that like that's where I still sort of lay in terms of the problem. Um, geez, I'm not much of a blueprinter. So like for me, I don't really try and outline a program or an approach. However, if you're really interested in the specific political dimensions of how I read D&G, I do have a article called "A Method to Their Madness," and it's my reading of D&G and Marxism. And it's in this journal called Stasis, which was run by like one of the only sort of non-captured universities in Russia. And it's a whole bunch of people who like try and put Marxism or their like weird Russian post-Soviet thing into communication with Western Marxism. And so they did a whole issue on Deleuze and Marx and stuff. And so like I contributed to it. There's a lot of it of things that I say that I don't like. So I'm like, I kind of get the J.K. Gibson Graham project, but which was really hip when I was in grad school. For those who haven't read J.K. Gibson Graham, there are these feminist geographers who argue that we don't actually live in a capitalist world, because if you actually just like look at all the forms of labor that people engage in, there's only a certain small sliver of it that is like meets the rigorous technical definition for capitalism. And so we've overemphasized it. They came out of this post-Althusserian formation called Rethinking Marxism that was kind of like UMass Amherst. And what they developed was a community-based local economies approach. So it's basically like economic development for non-capitalists. And the funny thing to me is they always seem to just sort of propose these like little initiatives that are common in college towns. So I kind of joke that they like want everything to be a college town. And it's right. I mean, like some of that stuff is pretty rad and it's like non-capitalist. It's not necessarily anti-capitalist, but it's ways for people to create different ways of socially relating to each other. And so it actually works alongside like very classic reading of D&G quite well. But I say that like it just doesn't have as much bite to it as I would want. I also read through the sort of like the Lambda and assemblage theory kind of stuff, and I'm just like, where's the politics here, everybody? I also criticize some like liberal approaches to it. And I basically like say that like what's most important about D&G is their minoritarianism. And that I think the minoritarian can work on all scales. But I think the key to the minoritarian is the minoritarian never tries to become majoritarian. And that's something that's really uncomfortable for some people because they're just so committed to the idea of winning means becoming the majority and being able to make everything modeled in the way that you want it to be. And so the sort of like permanent minoritarian status combined with nomadism, I think really gives you I mean, it's not the Foucauldian like, oh, I'm going to be the fly in the ointment. It's more that you're always experimenting with these like fringe radical, you're on the leading edge, you're the avant-garde, or you're setting up this mental health utopia facility on the edge of Paris in a former chateau. I mean, like all these like really unexpected things. And I think they're all amazing. I mean, if you all haven't read the what's it called, Intersecting Lives, the Francois Dust book, like it's really great. I mean, I think it gives you a lot of sense of the sort of like flavor and character of what everything was going through at that time. And then you have to ask yourself, like, okay, that was what was going on late 60s, 70s, and 80s. Like, what might this be in a different place in a different time now? And so the things that I pull up from are the nomadology and the minoritarian, but as connected to like political stuff. What does it mean for me? Well, I've been working with a film collective. We call ourselves the Destructionist International, and we recently did a desktop documentary film project that you can see online. It's very much in this sort of problematic approach. It's like we just try and renew problematics, give them new life. try and ask like what is or should be film in 2023, or even just like what is thinking in 2023, something that is like really not that powerful. It sort of doesn't happen all the time and it's hard to measure. And I think it's not, starting some mainstream podcast or, becoming a thought leader or whatever. It's really to figure out what that minoritarian means. I don't know. I think I probably like free associated a little too much here, but hopefully that gives you an image of it.
Thank you. We have some time. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, I have a couple of my own, and maybe this is related to, so Emma was asking, what's the project at the end of the world? And I'm wondering maybe more about like, what's the process? And I noticed that in Dark Deleuze, it's very much a political project. A project emphasizing destruction. So part of my question is, what exactly are we destroying? How do you kind of define the outside or exteriority? I noticed in your comments, you were saying it's not so much against the state. And maybe you could clarify that a little bit more. And in reference to the fact that you brought up Francis Bacon, which I'm just like obsessed with. Is it possible that this kind of destruction happens more so through aesthetics? And so I know that you're very much into like film and all of these things. That's really what I'm interested in. So I really like revolution through aesthetics. And I kind of wonder how that kind of fits together with destruction at the end of the world, or if it does, or if it's not supposed to, how politics and aesthetics kind of fit together, if they do at all, or violence and aesthetics. And then just a curiosity question. Have you seen the film Infinity Pool?
Oh, great question. I love the young Cronenberg. I haven't seen all of his work most recently. But I know it's cool.
Okay.
I mean, this is the Cronenberg one we're talking about, right?
His son?
Brian Cronenberg, yeah.
Yeah, it's his son, and he's done like only like two or three films, and this was the one that just came out recently, so 2023, I think.
It's not the Hitman. The Possessor's the Hitman one.
That's not the Possessor. It came out after that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I haven't seen Infinity Pool yet.
Okay.
I mean, I love it.
Yeah, it just seems like it could be like it seems like on tone, yeah.
Yeah. Aesthetics. I mean, like, politics and aesthetics program I teach, we're always trying to figure out what this means. The name of the program came around with the sort of like interest in Rancière. And I think Rancière's project has shifted a little bit. There was this sort of like, we could call mid Rancière or maybe late Rancière, whatever disagreement comes around. But he's been leaning on Deleuze for his concept of thesis, which he's giving more content than what the original Greek would be. But like for him, he's saying that when there are two ontological orders that don't match, like there's some sort of mismatch between them, like that mismatch is a space for politics to happen. And it can be thought of in a question of aesthetics, whereby it's like two regimes of resemblance or something come in conflict, and there's either like a gap or a tension, and it's revealed through some sort of representational project. Of course, the key element from his earlier work in Disagreement is about the part that has no part, or like the thing that can't be represented, and the power of the thing that can't be represented. He loves the Greeks, and so like the example in the Greeks is that like like landowning men, of course, are the people who can come to the public sphere or the agora and talk and vote, and their sort of like expression is politics. And so there are obviously like women, children of slaves who don't count, and if they were to talk, it just wouldn't be registered. But then there's also like the Métis and the Metics, like people who are not Greek citizens, and this question of the count. And the like shortcut to all of this is to talk about the barbarians who like get their name as, their talk is just seen as like jumbling gibber. So it's bar, 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 bar. And so they're the barbarians. They're the people who like can't be understood and can't speak and that sort of thing. And so I like that element. I think he overdoes it, or like the consequences he draws from it aren't as interesting. But I like the power of the unseen or invisible or the ignored or the unintelligible. And I think that that works along with the non-representational, non-resemblance form of Deleuze's metaphysics quite well. I think it also works along like how people sometimes talk about like the shock to thought. Masumi has a couple essays that sort of try and explain or elaborate on the Deleuzean idea of shock to thought. I'd written some stuff on bacon and sautine and like the flesh a long time ago. I'd have to revisit it to figure out exactly what I was thinking at that time. But I think for me, like the job of thought is not to give solutions, but to like upset things that we've taken for granted. And so a lot of the ways that we can do that is aesthetic. It has to not be cheap, right? Because like there are things that like a jump scare or something that like frighten us, but then it doesn't provoke anything else. And so it has to be something that like disrupts conceptual categories or other things that like we take as given. But I think there's a lot of art that does this. I work a decent amount with like conceptual and art films too, where this is very much the purpose. And the things that they reveal are sometimes fairly simple, but still quite interesting. So like one of the most important Russian constructivist films is Dziga Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera. And the film doesn't really have much narrative content. I mean, broadly, it's about the disorientation that comes with being in a modern city. And, in that way, it's sort of building on sort of like mid 19th century sociology and philosophy that was trying to come to grips with the Industrial Revolution and urbanism. But what's interesting about Vertov is that he's using this new technology that is film and cinema, and so he's just trying to invent as many shots as possible, like things that haven't been done before. And the essence of what he's doing is playing with movement. And so it will be like, okay, a stable shot, like maybe handheld or like on a tripod or something, and then it'll be like a car on the street. But that's like simple, right? Because then you can actually have a camera on a horse next to a car and like trying to see that type of movement. And then there's also like the moving of the camera itself, where the camera can become a character. And so once you start incorporating all those elements of movement, it creates a sense of disorientation, but also excitement and all these other things. And I think that like those questions of what can film or a particular genre or like aesthetic device do that we can't otherwise is really the realm of where we get aesthetic intervention. And it's generally on a somewhat formal level. Storytelling sometimes has something to do with it, but it's not the most interesting piece. So I'm trying to think of like how this, more modern versions of this that sort of tickle it for me. I mean, like, so Deleuze is interested in how it interacts with time, of course. And, his cinema too is very much about like European art house cinema after World War II and how that's disrupting how people think about time. But there's been this sort of like fun project that everyone's been trying to be like, well, what's a cinema 3 or a cinema 4? thinking that like things would have to continue changing as things get more and more periodized. Lazzarato has a really great book that was his dissertation called Video Philosophy, in which he tries to distinguish like cinema-based film from new media and digital film that was starting to be invented in the 80s, and try and understand what those aesthetics would do as well. And to not get too pop culture-y, but I think we live in such a digital era these days too. Like people have not only talked about like network aesthetics, but we're probably in a sort of like post-network aesthetics time where it's sort of like death of the internet. And in the art world, they talk about that as like post-internet art. And so it's people who are like raised on the internet and feel like they're sort of like marinated in the internet, but are also looking for some sort of outside or escape from it as well. And so the political project, I think that's interesting, and that links back to a lot of the modernism and avant-garde that we've been talking about previously, is that like there are forms of revolution that aren't like a Leninist political revolution. Like when you think of a Leninist political revolution, it's like the essence of a state is its coercive apparatus. And once you're able to seize the coercive apparatus, you're able to then redirect the state for whatever means you want. And this is all outlined in State and Revolution. We have some alternative conceptions of, let's say, a social revolution or a cultural revolution that we tie with something like the New Left, or even Fanon asking about like what would it mean for colonized people to break from the colony. It has to be more than just having your own government. Maybe it has to do with nationalism or culture or economics or these other things. And so I think that like aesthetics is a really important or convenient realm to start thinking about what other approaches or images of revolution might be, because like not only does the process look different, but we've had them. We usually don't talk about them as such, and they've completely changed, let's say, society or social formations without even necessarily engaging with formal political institutions. Okay, sorry, that was a little circular, but hopefully it addressed a lot of the things that you brought up.
Thank you. We're at time, but I don't know if anybody else has one more question I wanted to ask Dr. Culp if you have time for one more, because I don't know if anybody does. If they don't, then we'll go ahead and end. But I just wanted to make sure. Okay.
I'm awful at email, but I love hearing from people and corresponding with them. If I like don't write back, it's not because I don't like you. Just write me a couple more times and I will respond. And I'm always interested in hearing people's new ideas, what they're working on. Like it's a really important thing for me. So I'd love to just even be able to connect with you all today. And I hope to hear from you all in the future.
I mean, thank you, Professor Culp. This has really been an interesting session. I want to thank you so much for your time, and thank you for the time, like doing this when you've just been on a flight. And yeah, hope you have a good time in London.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a great meeting.
Thank you, and
yeah.
see you.